Conservatives' Corner believes conservatism rests on three main pillars: biblical precedent, natural law, and federalism. Obviously, there are many more philosophies which support the principles of conservatism, but Conservatives' Corner believes these three pillars hold the most weight. Some commentators like to simplify conservatism and categorize conservatives as either social conservatives, fiscal conservatives, or national security conservatives. Although there is some utility to this categorizing, Conservatives' Corner believes conservatism is much more dynamic than this, which is why we will be presenting a more in-depth examination of conservatism in these presentations. The pillar of biblical precedent refers to the Bible as the preeminent source of societal governance. The Bible contains a code of ethics prescribed initially to the ancient Israelites in the Hebrew Scriptures, and later reinforced in the New Testament. This is what is commonly referred to as Judeo-Christian values, because those of the Jewish and Christian faiths share a textual authority for their moral laws, even if they disagree theologically. It should be pointed out, a person does not necessarily need to be a Jew or a Christian, or even have a belief in God, to follow a conservative philosophy. However, our examination of biblical precedent does presume God is the ultimate authority of morals and ethics, as articulated in the Bible. In part one of this presentation, we will be considering God's authority. We begin this journey by examining God's authority over humanity, which takes us to the Garden of Eden. The first few chapters in the book of Genesis contain the famous account of God's creation of mankind, as well as the sin that followed. God's intention for his creation was a condition of bliss and happiness. The only caveat was that his creation, Adam, and by extension Eve, was to submit to his authority, which meant obedience. Adam was commanded to not consume a specific fruit in the Garden of Eden, but he defied this instruction. This one proverbial act of disobedience was the first act of sin. As a result, Adam and Eve were banished from an existence of ultimate happiness. Suffering and labor became part of our existence, and mortality was a plague placed on humanity. Just a quick side note to point out. The Garden of Eden was intended to be a sort of utopia, to borrow a humanist term, a land of bliss, a place where God would provide all of the needs of humanity, such as food and comfort. No work was required, and humanity could live off the land, as the saying goes. Ironically, this is exactly what our counterparts on the political left are trying to recreate through human efforts. Communism and socialism are futile efforts to subvert God and replace him as the caretaker of humanity's existence and happiness. By taking God's authority out of the picture, liberal humanists attempt to ascend his throne and provide the Garden of Eden he originally created. In contrast, conservatives understand our labors and self-accountability are required to obtain resources, and no human authority or government can provide true happiness. Returning to our consideration of Adam. Adam's first act of disobedience is commonly referred to in Christian circles as the doctrine of original sin. Not all Christians incorporate this specific doctrine into their belief system, and it has a long history of debate among Christian theologians. But even Christians who do not subscribe to this specific doctrine recognize that man has a sin nature, which requires an atonement, Christ. However, the doctrine of original sin is not exactly familiar to rabbinical Judaism. Historically, Orthodox Judaism has held Adam accountable for much of humanity's sufferings, but more modern and less orthodox Judaism believes humans are essentially born sin-free and choose to sin later in life. It is a more common belief in various denominations of Judaism that Adam is responsible for ushering in human mortality. Another closely related concept in Judaism worth a little more research is tikkun olam. We won't examine this concept further here, but it is something you may wish to independently research. After Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden because of disobedience, God established a set of laws as a mechanism to evade the consequences of sin. These laws not only facilitated humanity's spiritual relationship with God, they also functioned as civil codes to maintain order among humanity's interaction with itself. In other words, God to human and human to human. The whole of the Bible is based on various laws and covenants. But the first 5 books, known as the Torah, are especially focused on the prescriptions of God's interaction with humanity and humanity's interactions with itself. The most notorious of these covenants is the Mosaic covenant, made between God and Moses, and by default the people of Israel. However, there were a few other covenants which preceded the Mosaic covenant that we will briefly examine. The first covenant was technically between God and Adam, which we have already considered. But just to clarify, this covenant was an exchange of God providing an existence of bliss for Adam and Eve, and in turn, they were required to obey God's commandment to refrain from eating a certain fruit. However, as a result of their disobedience, they endured many consequences, including banishment, strife between husband and wife, suffering, pain, and ultimately death. In fact, the first murder recorded occurred between 2 of Adam and Eve's children when Cain murdered his own brother Abel. When wickedness increased exponentially, according to the first 5 chapters of the book of Genesis, God established another covenant with Noah. This is a concept more familiar to rabbinical Judaism, known as the 7 Laws of Noah. Although there is no consensus of what constitutes these laws, there is agreement that they include some variation of the following: no idolatry, no sexual immorality, no murdering, no stealing, no eating live animals, no blasphemy, and the establishment of courts of law. The next covenant we will examine is particularly important to conservatives, as it largely contributes to our worldview concerning international politics and even domestic national security. It is the Abrahamic covenant. In addition to declaring monotheism, the Abrahamic covenant established 2 major tenets. 1. It distinguished a specific group of people. 2. It created a geographical nation. Regarding the Abrahamic covenant, distinguishing a people, God informed Abraham that he would be the patriarch of countless descendants. In particular, Abraham would be the father of Isaac, the grandfather of Jacob, and the great-grandfather of Judah, of whom the term Jew is derived. Jews believe the famous King David is a descendant of Abraham, and Christians also extend this genealogy to Jesus. Abraham's family tree is quite extensive and can be pieced together in many different places throughout the Bible. The point is that God unequivocally distinguished the Jewish people as His people and promises to curse those who come against them. Regarding the Abrahamic covenant creating a geographical nation, the first thing we need to recognize, and that cannot be emphasized enough, is that God actually deeded a land to the people He distinguished. Please refer to Genesis chapter 15, verses 18 through 21, and Exodus chapter 23, verse 31 for proof texts. The second thing to acknowledge is the location and size of the nation of Israel. Biblically, the geographical boundaries extend as far east as the extent of the Euphrates River, and as far west as the length of the Nile River in Egypt. Unfortunately, the modern state of Israel, created in 1948, is a fraction of what was historically intended. This is a map of the modern state of Israel when it gained independence in 1948. This is a map of Israel after the 1967 Six-Day War. This is a map of Israel as of the day this video was produced. The current conflict of the Jewish state will be discussed in other presentations. So, the Abrahamic covenant provides the basis of two main ideas in conservatism's worldview. First, it establishes anti-Semitism as undeniably evil. Second, it substantiates the historical and contemporary Jewish claims on a specific piece of real estate in the Middle East. Let's now turn to the Mosaic covenant. This is the most well-known covenant, as it is the foundation of historical and rabbinical Judaism, as well as Christianity. More than laying out the specifics of a legal code, the Mosaic covenant reinforced monotheism as the central proclamation of the Jewish people. This is declared by what is referred to as the Shema. Shema is a Hebrew phrase which is loosely translated hear or listen, and it is the beginning of Moses' declaration to the people of Israel in the book of Deuteronomy, which reads, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. This presupposition stipulated, the Mosaic covenant establishes the famous Ten Commandments, which we have broken down into two main categories, theological laws and societal laws. The theological laws are, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make yourself any idols. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, and remember the Sabbath. The societal laws are, honor your father and mother. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not commit adultery. And you shall not covet your neighbor's wife or property. We will be focusing on some of the societal laws for the purposes of this video, specifically those commandments which are in large part the basis of conservatism's pillar of biblical precedent. You shall not murder is the precedent for conservatives being against abortion. However, murder should be distinguished from an overarching definition of killing. People may be killed in self-defense and can be killed in combat. By default, murder is the killing of innocent or undeserving human life, such as the premeditated killing of a human adult or the abortion of a baby. You shall not steal, and you shall not covet your neighbor's property, is the precedent for conservatives being against socialism. For example, you shall not steal presumes private property. You shall not covet property precludes the compulsory redistribution of wealth. You shall not commit adultery, and you shall not covet your neighbor's wife establishes the precedent for marriage as monogamous and heterosexual. The purpose of the Mosaic Law was to provide a vehicle of reconciliation between man and God, a mechanism for personal happiness and order among a society. The Ten Commandments also provide the basis for a set of approximately 613 laws, which were prescribed to the people of Israel specifically. Although these more numerous laws were based on the Ten Commandments, they provided a much more nuanced system of moral laws, ceremonial laws, and judicial laws, and have historically been the foundation of the religion of Judaism. Christianity also draws its morality from Christ's summation of the Mosaic covenant. When asked what the greatest commandment is, Christ replied, "You shall love the Lord your God and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. In the next video, we will be taking a closer look at the practical applications made in the covenants between God and humanity.